Hello and welcome to another episode of Safe State. Today we're going to be looking at part 3 of the history of protection of the history of child protection in the UK. Let me just add the slides. Okay. Right, so the first case that I want to look at, we got up to 1994, and the first one I want to look at is Ricky Neave. Now, you may very well remember this case. It was quite widely publicised, and Ricky was 6 years old, and he lived with his mum, Ruth Neave, on the Welland estate in Peterborough, and that was with his 2 sisters. Now, he no longer lived with his dad, who was Dean Neave, and on the 28th of November of 1994, he was reported missing by his mum, and that was at around 6:30 in the evening. So her account to police was that she'd allowed him to walk to school alone at around 9:30 a.m. So that was after school had started, and that she'd only realised that he was missing when he didn't come home for his tea later. School hadn't rang mum to let her know that he wasn't in school, and that isn't ideal. We would expect most schools to make a phone call to parents if their child has not arrived and they've not already received a call from the parent to indicate why they are not in school. But in this particular case, Ricky was well known to regularly truant from school, so I think that's probably why they didn't let her know at that time. He was later found after a big scale search. He was found in woodland at the end of their estate, and it's literally like minutes from their home. I'm going to apologise for the fact that I sound a little bit nasally. My allergies are playing up something rotten. There are many benefits to spring. It's the 12th of May that I'm doing this. Many benefits. One of them is not the fact that the pollen count and count for everything is high. So I am struggling with my sinuses because of allergies. So I apologise, but I didn't want to miss doing this. So just have to put up with me sounding nasally. So he was found in this woodland, and it was literally minutes from his home. And he was found naked and posed in a star shape, so a little bit like the Vitruvian Man. And so there were some question marks at the time around whether it was a ritualistic killing, whether it was somebody that he knew, whether it was a stranger abduction. There were lots of theories going around. But statistically, we know that if you follow Occam's razor, the likelihood is that if a child goes missing, it's normally at the hands of somebody that they know. Very often it's somebody within their family circle, and in fact, more often than not, it's one of their primary caregivers. So what did that mean in this case? It meant that all eyes turned sharply to look at mum. And the reason that it was mum that came under the spotlight was because of their background. So Mum had a history of substance misuse. Her ex-husband, Dean, had described leaving because of the way that Mum treated the children. And he said that she was always shouting, screaming, hitting them, and he didn't like it and he couldn't get her to change. So he ended up leaving. Now, if we look at some of the things that Mum has been known to do, and they were known for many, many years to social services. And some of the things that it's recorded that have happened to the children at the hands of Mum are when Ricky was aged 3 years and 9 months. So think about that. He's not even at compulsory school age. He was left locked outside of their home in his pajamas, screaming at the top of his voice as a punishment. On one occasion, in front of police officers, she grabbed him around the neck until he went red in the face. On another occasion, they went to the chemist, and the chemist actually reported that she'd thumped Ricky so hard that he actually went flying out of the door. In August of 1994, so not much before Ricky's life was tragically cut short, Mum lost her temper with Ricky, and that was because he'd called her a not very nice name. He'd called her an SLAG, and her response to this was to force him against the wall, push his head back, forcibly open his mouth, and then pour washing up liquid into it. Which I think there are probably very many more effective ways to discipline a child for poor language. And no doubt, having seen her in the press, she was probably using bad language whilst telling him off for using it himself. A month before his disappearance, so we're looking at October 1994, Mum had allegedly threatened to kill Ricky because she asked him for sweets at a newsagent's. And in the very short period before he was taken, he had the word idiot scrawled across his forehead, and Mum also told social workers quite directly to take Ricky off her hands, because if they didn't, she would end up killing him. So there were significant incidents that were occurring across quite a long period of time. And not only that, but we know that Mum had a problem with substance misuse, and actually she used Ricky, bearing in mind that when he passed away, he was 6. She used Ricky to collect drugs for her. So she used to send him with a note to the dealer that said, "Please give Ricky my sherbet." And that was, he was collecting amphetamines for her. We know a little bit more about the children's treatment, because since this whole incident took place, Ricky's sister Rochelle has given a number of interviews, one of which was with PA News Agency, and she recalled the abuse that they suffered at Mum's hands. Apologies. And in her words, she said it was a punch or a kick or a shove down the stairs. She would pull you by your hair, smack you with a hairbrush if you didn't want to brush your hair. So, there was no love lost between Rochelle and her mum. But by contrast, when she spoke about Ricky, she spoke about him being loving and caring, and that he would do anything for his sisters. And if there was no food in, for example, which often happened, he would go to the shop and steal some and bring it back for his sisters to make sure that they were fed. He always made sure that they were clean. He would run them a bath, make sure they got to school. So he took on a significant caring role for his siblings, even though he was 6 years old. Now, Mum, she had previous convictions for burglary and supplying amphetamine, so not just using them, supplying them. And because of the background and the threats that she'd made in the presence of a number of witnesses about taking Ricky's life, she was arrested, and in fact she was tried for his murder but was acquitted. But during the course of those proceedings, what she did do was admit cruelty against all three of the children, Ricky and both of his sisters. She admitted to hitting them, burning them, throwing them across the room and locking them outside. And for that, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Now, there was a report made by Social Services Inspectorate 3 years after the incident. And that found that fault primarily lay with senior management at Cambridgeshire Social Services Department in terms of why things had been allowed to escalate to the point that they had without them taking protective action to safeguard Ricky. And that's all very well and good, but that then left a very big unanswered question, which was what really happened to him. And it remained an unsolved case until the 21st of April 2022. So very recently, when James Watson, who at the time of the incident was 13 years of age, was convicted of unaliving Ricky. So you might be wondering why this case is on my list, even though it wasn't Mum that actually harmed Ricky. And the reason is this. Social Services had allowed this case to escalate to a point where at the age of 6, Ricky was not within the control of his mum. He wasn't going to school. He wasn't properly supervised. He was neglected, as were his sisters, and they were all being subject to physical abuse. And at no stage did Cambridge Social Services take protective action against Ricky and his sisters and remove them from that environment. Had they done that, then Ricky would not have been walking to school on his own after the school starting time, so when there would be none of his friends or their parents around, and he wouldn't have fallen prey to the predator that was James Watson. It's as simple as that. That sliding doors moment where they chose not to issue proceedings and take Ricky out of that environment was the moment that sealed his fate. Now then, We then got some additions to the legislative framework. In 1995, we got the current legislative framework for child protection systems in Northern Ireland and Scotland. So we got the Children Northern Ireland Order 1995 and the Children's Scotland Act 1995. And then in 1997, we got the Criminal Records Check System established under Part 4 of the Police Act of 1997. Now, that was a huge step forward because it meant that we could ensure that we had knowledge and understanding of the people who were in children's lives, whether that be working with them, moving into a family's home, or any of those things. We understood, or we were able to understand what the background of those people was. And that means that we can look at analysing what the risk level is for those children. And that is a hugely important piece of the puzzle in trying to work out, whether anything needs to be done to protect any given child. Now, in 1999, we got a few things that happened. So devolution happened, which meant that responsibility was transferred from the Houses of Parliament to the national governments in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Then we got a revised version of Working Together to Safeguard Children, that big piece of guidance that we talked about in one of the previous episodes. And that looks at providing guidance around supporting children and families, how to learn lessons from research and experience. And it also provided some definitions around what constitutes abuse. It's very difficult to safeguard children if you can't define what it is you're safeguarding them from. And then we got the Protection of Children Act 1999, and that was aimed at preventing child predators from working with children. And it means that childcare organisations in England and Wales are required to inform the Department of Health about anyone who is known to them who is suspected of harming children or putting them at risk. And then in 2003, so moving on a little bit, a similar act was passed in Scotland. So some big leaps there in how the system and safeguards were put into place during that period. And then if we move on, we next can look at Dylan Lockerbie. Now, Dylan lost his life very tragically in March of 1996. And at that point, he was 5 months old. And he lived in Dumfries and Galloway with his mum, Maureen Lockerbie, and his father, her fiance, Ian Metcalfe. He was 34 at the time. Now, Ian had had 2 sons who tragically lost their lives. Kyle, who was aged 10 weeks in 1988. His mum was a different person. And Dylan, who was aged 5 months when he passed away in March of 1996. And initially, both of these children's deaths were put down to sudden infant death syndrome, what was then colloquially known as cot death. Following an investigation, Ian Metcalfe was arrested and tried for murder and attempted murder of Kyle and Dylan, and also assault asphyxiation and endangering the life of another child. Now, that child can't be named for legal reasons, but at the High Court in Edinburgh, he was found guilty on all of those counts. And the court heard during that trial that there were a number of experts and doctors who said that the children had been physically abused rather than being subject to sudden infant death syndrome. Both were found to have multiple rib fractures before their death and had been subject to previous suffocation attacks. Now, I'm assuming that they can tell that from lung tissue, but I don't know. I haven't seen what the expert evidence entailed. And bearing in mind that after a full trial, and bearing in mind there were 3 children involved in this, and Ian Metcalfe was found guilty on all counts relating to all 3 children. The mother of Dylan, Maureen Lockerbie, who was his fiancée at the time, still protested his innocence and pledged to stand by him, which completely baffles me. Children's Social Care admitted it was an error not putting Dylan on the child protection register. And they said that whilst they were involved with Dylan after his birth, they didn't believe that he was specifically at risk of any kind of physical harm. And an inquiry basically established that these failings were the result of weaknesses in the service arrangements within the Children's Services department at that point, and also individual errors of judgment. And what they said was that procedures had improved since the inquiry and since Dylan's death, and that appropriate disciplinary action was taken, but they wouldn't give specifics about what that included. But one assumes that whoever the person was who made the error in judgment, they were dealt with under disciplinary proceedings. Now, last but not least for today, we've got Lauren Creed. This takes us to 1997. And Lauren, at the time that she passed away on the 21st of October of 1997, was 5 years of age. And she lived in Norfolk in the UK with her mother, Sharon Creed, who was 25. Now, she was an RAF senior aircraft woman, and mum's boyfriend, who was called Graham Sate, and he was 25 at the time and was a merchant seaman with what can only be described as a violent past. Now, during her life, Lauren was subjected to cruel treatment at the hands of both her mum and Graham Sate. In particular, between March and October of 1997, mum was later convicted of cruelty in relation to that period. During the time before Lauren's life was taken in the way that it was, there were reports to both the civilian police and the RAF police and social services by concerned people, and nothing happened. And then on the 21st of October 1997 came the tragic day when Lauren was thrown down the stairs and then jumped on by Graham Sate. Mum's boyfriend. Now, when Mum got home, she waited for 90 minutes on top of the time that it took her to get home before calling an ambulance. Pathologists identified that Lauren's tiny body had suffered a split liver, which is the kind of injury that's usually indicative of a really forceful punch or a stamp or a kick or something like that to the stomach area. She'd also suffered hemorrhaging in her intestines, a broken rib, abrasions on her face, swelling to her head, and the post-mortem report says, and I can't say it any better, the magnitude of violence inflicted upon her was evident in the alarming 167 fresh bruises and abrasions found on her little body. 167. I mean, where do you actually find places for 167 bruises on a little 5-year-old's body? It blows my mind. This poor girl, what she must have gone through in those last, moments and hours of her life is just not worth thinking about at all. But we have to think about it. We have to acknowledge and recognise what happens to these children, and we have to do something to make it different for the future. That's what this is about. I'm not sat here talking about, bad things that have happened to children because I like talking about bad things that have happened to children. But this is what I deal with day in and day out as part of my job. And what we need to do is learn to do better. We need to get better at spotting the signs, identifying the risks, and then taking action to make a difference before it's too late. And in many cases, we do. We do take protective action very early on. We identify the risks and all of those things, but sometimes we get it wrong, and they're the times that we can learn from what we've done wrong and hopefully make things better for the future. After Lauren's death, there was a trial. Mum was convicted of child cruelty and she got 5 years imprisonment. Graham Sate got convicted of Lauren's unaliving and received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. So in the UK, what happens is it's a mandatory life sentence for murder convictions. But then the judge has to decide based on all of the mitigating factors and the aggravating factors that are present in that case, what's the right minimum term that they should serve. And that is literally the minimum amount of time that they will stay in the prison. After that, they are eligible to seek parole, which means that they would then be allowed to re-enter society if the parole board feels that they have been rehabilitated enough and it's safe to do so. But they then remain on licence for the rest of their life. So if they do anything else, straight back to finish off their life sentence. So that's how it works in the UK. So we got a minimum of 25 years, but he also got convicted of another offence, an attempted unaliving of Carol Wilkinson, which is a person who he stabbed 6 times and punctured her lung. And he got 7 years extra for that. There was an inquiry after the criminal proceedings, and that showed that there were failures from pretty much everywhere. So there were failures by probation officers, social services, the police, and health authorities. And all of the agencies involved accepted that they'd failed to keep adequate records, to communicate properly, and to hold a case conference when they should have. But what they did say, and this was kind of a uniform message from all of the professionals involved, was that it was really difficult to get a clear, full picture of Lauren's circumstances because she travelled around the country with a mum who was serving in the Royal Air Force. So it made it very difficult to put the pieces of the jigsaw together. So we always talk about every professional has got a little piece of the puzzle. And it's only when you put all the jigsaw pieces together that you get a full picture of what's happening in that child's life. But in this case, not only have you got the different professionals and services that have got different bits of the puzzle, you've got those same services from different places around the country. And they don't always pass the information on when people move, unfortunately. And they should, and it's something that has become much more consistent over the years. But particularly when this happened, working together to safeguard children was still quite a young concept and a young bit of guidance, and things didn't always quite work as smoothly as it ought. David Lambert from Norfolk Social Services said during the inquiry, a number of mistakes and errors in subtle judgment were made. These mistakes were not made willfully or negligently, but primarily because none of the agencies was aware of the whole picture. And I think it really sums up what the problem is in many, many cases. And this is where things go terribly wrong, because nobody understands how high a risk is because they've only got one piece of the picture. There was a neighbour called Sophia Baker who, she was so concerned about this little girl's battered state across kind of the period of time before she passed away that she tapes her whilst asking her, what's happened to you? Where has this particular bruise come from? When she showed up with another bruise. And she records her saying, Daddy punched me in the belly today. He slapped me and he punched me. Now, Mrs. Baker offered that tape to the police when they came to investigate a domestic incident at the girl's home, because she wanted the police to see how bruised the girl was on occasions. But they didn't take it. And Ken Williams, the Chief Constable of Norfolk Police, said, with hindsight, we should have taken possession of that tape. It was regrettable that a tape recording of the youngster describing how she was beaten was not seized. I think on that particular occasion, it was the case that they were looking at one particular thing, which was a domestic incident involving the parents. When they were offered something about a totally different thing, they just didn't want to know because it wasn't related to what they were investigating. And I think, it's important that police, in particular police, but all professionals, kind of keep an open mind and don't have the same kind of linear thinking that we're sometimes guilty of. So, I'm here to investigate domestic abuse. I'm not going to take the tape about child abuse. Mum was cruel to a child. She must have been the one that unalived them. You've got to keep an open mind, and you've got to follow all lines of inquiry when you're investigating these incidents. Now, I'm going to leave it there for today. We've been going for 37 minutes, so I think that's plenty. Obviously, we'll move on to part 4 in the next couple of days, and hopefully kind of keep cracking on and getting through this. Bearing in mind, we're only up to 1997 and we need to get to 2024. But I want to do them in kind of slightly smaller chunks because I think there was a lot in in the earlier videos and it might be too much. So let me know which format you prefer. I'm thinking the slightly shorter format might work quite well, but I am open to your feedback. Right, okay, so it just leaves for me to say thank you so much, everybody. Unashamed plug. Please can you subscribe, like the video and share the video. If you've watched to the end, you're amazing. And look after yourselves. Please stay safe. And if you see something, say something. I'll see you next time.